Good afternoon, good morning, or evening, depending on where you are joining us today. Welcome to the webinar, Mental Health and BIPOC Communities, the second webinar in the series, Holding Sacred Space, Mental Health and Faith. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as a Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. For participants who are blind or low vision, or perhaps only listening, I'm a Korean American woman with long black hair tied back, wearing a white button-down shirt. I will be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Reverend Kendall McBroom, who serves as the Director of Civil and Human Rights, and Toyomi Yoshida, who is our tech support. As shared during our first webinar, we want to acknowledge that where the United Methodist Building is located in Washington, D.C., is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Anacostan people who lived for generations neighboring the Piscataway and the Pamunkey peoples. We gratefully acknowledge Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather and the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. A short overview of our time together. After the presentation, there will be a time of Q&A. Please enter your Q&A questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. After the Q&A, Reverend Kendall McBroom will share ways you can get involved today legislatively to address mental health. I am so excited to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. Sarah Vinson is a triple certified physician who specializes in adult, child, adolescent, and forensic psychiatry, and is a professor of pediatrics and psychiatry and the chair of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Morehouse School of Medicine. In addition to maintaining an active clinical practice where she sees a socioeconomically diverse clientele, she is the founder of Forio Forensics, a MBE-certified, multidisciplinary, culturally and structurally informed forensic mental health consultation company. Dr. Vinson is a national thought leader regarding the intersections of social justice, criminal justice, and mental health. She has co-authored numerous articles and has co-edited 2 books, Pediatric Mental Health for Primary Care Providers and Social Injustice and Mental Health. Dr. Vinson, thank you so much for being with us today. We are so glad to hear from you today.
Thank you. I'm really glad to join you, and am looking forward to not just the prepared content, but getting to have some discussion as well. So I wanted to be sure to leave time for that. Not at the beginning of my presentation. Hold on. Okay, here we go. All right, so the topic I was asked to present on today is mental health and BIPOC communities. And, this topic of mental health and people who are marginalized because of race is one that is based in, personal experience, but also my experience as a mental health clinician in both public and private sector spaces, where I've seen majority, minority, or if we want to use that term, people who really span the socioeconomic spectrum, with the lower SES class folks in the public spaces and higher SES in private ones. And I can tell you that these issues of marginalization on the basis of race show up across the board, but sometimes in different forms. And this perspective is also informed by doing work with ERCs in corporate America, but also work at the forensic mental health interface as well. And so those are just some disclaimers in terms of my lens. Of course, I write and talk about it, but most people who find their life's work or their life passion had that informed by early experiences, and I'm certainly in that camp as well. So when we're talking about something as broad as BIPOC communities, it's really important to keep in mind that there is tremendous diversity, and even the term BIPOC itself, I think, has some issues, right? So it stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and it kind of lumps everybody in together, and by everybody, the more precise way to describe that would be everybody who is not white, right? So there's a way that BIPOC as a term even centers whiteness as kind of the invisible norm, and is kind of reflective of the way that we clump people of color together, and the ways that certain groups don't get as much attention or thought when it comes to discussions of race. So there's race, right, which is a huge means of social stratification and marker that can marginalize people. But within racial identities, right, there are other identities. There are other forms of societal hierarchy that people experience. And it could be that there are aspects of people's identity that are more salient to them than race, or that have an interaction with their identification with race. And it's not an additive, it creates this whole other dimension. And so when you're thinking about race, you also might think about ethnicity. You also might think about country of origin. As someone who was born in the US, that blue passport has a certain privilege that's attached to it, right? And so thinking about race and intersecting identities is really important. And also thinking about race and mental health when it comes to youth, particularly if we're focusing on the United States. When we look at it compared to nations with similar income and domestic products, we far fall behind in the investment that we make in young people. So there's also a certain disadvantaged class that youth fall in our country when you look at things like poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, things of that nature, and just how our society allocates resources. And that's another intersect, right? When you're talking about the BIPOC community, if you're going to use that term, and intersectionality. And a lot of times adultism is one of those isms that is overlooked. But when we look at the population of young people in this country, a larger proportion of them are not white. So there are these different kinds of identities, but there's also just the fact that there are a lot of people that are overlooked in the BIPOC term, and I'll highlight Asian and Pacific Islanders here. But there's a way that is kind of reflective of what you see in the literature and in what you see in common discussions, right? And there's been more discussion in the wake of Asian hate and there being a focus on and an uptick in hate crimes targeting Asian people. But what we've seen and what we've heard for a long time is that this is a population, when you're talking about minoritized racial populations, that is just overlooked and not thought of. And BIPOC as a term is kind of a recreation of that. I also want to acknowledge that the term Latinx or Hispanic, it is still loaded, and there are all kinds of opinions on where that falls, but this is a very heterogeneous group of people as well. And then we also want to make sure that we're considering people who identify as being multiracial. And one of the things that we see when you talk about groups that are kind of invisible and not given a lot of attention, this multiracial group is one where that's the case as well. What we find often is that when we look at epidemiological studies of mental health or mental illness rates or treatment outcomes or trajectories of mental illness, that often, particularly when it comes to youth, people who identify as multiracial are a group that has worse outcomes. And it's often just kind of remarked upon as like an interesting finding, but you really don't see a lot of mental health research focusing on people who identify as multiracial. So it's another gap in the literature, and also another one of those gaps is kind of reflected in the language we use sometimes when we're talking about race. So I just wanted to acknowledge that on the front end. So this definition from the World Health Organization describes mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So I graduated medical school in 2007 and have been in the mental health field since that time. And I can tell you that the healthcare system in the US is really a sick care system. And that's even more so the case when it comes to mental illness, that people don't have well visits for mental health concerns. And as a part of that, right, like you have a system that really is constructed to focus on pathology and symptoms and diagnoses. And so often the mental health care system is a place where maybe you get somebody back to their baseline, but it's not always one that is promoting health. And it's not always one where considerations of health are centered. And as someone who did residency and 2 fellowships, and at well-respected places, I can tell you there was very few, I can't remember a single lecture that was completely devoted to this idea of mental health. And I say that because even in sometimes our discussions about mental health, even if we're not saying it, on some level, we're thinking about illness, we're thinking about diagnoses, we're thinking about something that's gone wrong, we're thinking about symptoms, we're thinking about something that has to be fixed. And often that idea of the fixing is that it's happening in the healthcare system. And I can tell you that most of what makes people sick and most of what helps them stay well has nothing to do with what I do and has nothing to do with the mental health care system. And this definition by the World Health Organization helps to underscore that, right? So if you pay attention to this definition, you can see a lot of it has to do with relationship. A lot of it has to do with what someone's day-to-day life looks like. A lot of it has to do with whether there's job opportunities or educational opportunities to position someone to perform a job. And there's a real community element to it, right? There's a lot in this definition that's going to depend on what is available to you in your environment, on what is stressing you out in your environment, on what the adaptive coping mechanisms available to you are, and what the maladaptive coping mechanisms available to you are, or in some cases are not. And so a lot of times in these discussions of mental health and mental illness, it's kind of set up as if it's dichotomous. You're either mentally ill or you're not. You're either mentally healthy or you're not. And medicine and the mental health field kind of lend itself to this more simplistic thinking because you have to decide if you can bill and you have to have something on the chart in order to do that, right? But it's another example of how the system isn't quite structured to capture the nuance of people's lived experiences. And we know that it's not that simple, right? It's not that you have a diagnosis or not, because there are lots of people who may have symptoms, but not meet criteria for a diagnosis, but those symptoms are still getting in their way, or they're giving them a lot of distress. So when we think about mental health, it's always helpful to consider it as being something that is on a continuum, that there are protective factors, supports, and adaptive coping, and in some instances, a genetic component to resilience that push people toward health. But there are risk factors and stressors and maladaptive coping, and in some instances, vulnerability to stressors that pushes people toward illness. But it's really important to hold that everyone is on this continuum and that people, depending on that ratio of stressors and protective factors and coping, can go up or down. And we actually had a very telling illustration of this when society went through COVID and all of the stressors that accompanied it. What we saw was that on a societal level, essentially across the board, that mental health symptoms, people who could qualify for mental health diagnoses increased. So it wasn't just that everybody all of a sudden had genetic changes that made them more vulnerable to mental health issues. It was that these social determinants of health took more of a toll on people. And so we saw more people on this continuum push toward illness in the wake of that collective trauma. And I start here in talking about communities that are marginalized because of race, because the stressors that those communities face because of that marginalization are constantly there. And they manifest in a number of ways. And so when we're thinking about this health to illness continuum, understanding that there's a certain weight that can come with being part of a marginalized communities. And this is something that's been well documented. People have looked at social hierarchy in all kinds of ways, even in like primate studies. So even, for example, if you were to take race out of it and look at societies that are pretty homogenous along those lines, when you introduce hierarchy, being at the wrong end of it, we know is something that can be really, really stressful for people. So when we consider race in the US, there are two groups in particular that really do push against the notions of the American dream, right? In order for America to be America the Beautiful, the full humanity of Black people who were enslaved or who are descendants of those people who were enslaved, and the full humanity of Indigenous Americans really have to be denied, right? Because this idea that people were sold and bred and that families were ripped apart and subjected to all kinds of assaults and terrors, and that this was culturally sanctioned and is in fact the bedrock of the American economy in so many ways when you look at it foundationally, goes against this idea we have of this country. And the fact that people were displaced and murdered, and that their culture was systematically taken away and diminished as their numbers plummeted by design. When you think about Indigenous Americans, it's the same thing, right? So there's a way that the humanity of Black people has been something that we couldn't center while also centering our ideal of America. And there's a way that Indigenous people have been marginalized both literally and figuratively to kind of keep their sacrifice out of sight and out of mind. And not sacrifice in terms of a voluntary one, but the sacrifice that was foisted upon them in order to make America possible. And so when you hold these things and you think about how you operate in the world, if you're not someone who's a member of this group, it's really important to mind the gap. So if you've ever been to London, you ride the subway, there's this announcement that comes on over and over again to the point where it's borderline obnoxious, but it says, mind the gap, right? And the idea is that this is such an important thing. It's worth reminding you all the time because it's easy to forget. And if you forget, the consequences of forgetting are so significant. And the same thing is true when we are in positions of power and we're making decisions or assessments regarding people who are in less powerful positions than we are. It's really important that we mind that gap in lived experiences. And what studies have actually shown us is that people who have more power start to become less empathetic, specifically, or even more so for people who don't have that same kind of power. And so it's something that we're susceptible to that we have to be really mindful of. So when it comes to mental well-being, what we know is that a lot of what makes people sick and a lot of what makes people well, actually the bulk of what makes people sick and what makes people well, has to do with what are called social determinants of health and social determinants of mental health. And so these are things like homelessness, food insecurity, low education, unemployment, criminal justice system involvement. And it's not the case for all minoritized racial groups, but if you look at it as a whole, people who are in minoritized racial groups in the US are more likely to experience a number of these adverse social determinants of health. So when we're considering BIPOC mental health on the population level, inequities along racial lines in education and employment and homelessness, which all exist, are things that are going to feed into inequities when it comes to mental health. It's also worth highlighting, because I don't think it gets as much attention, the inequities as it relates to pollution exposure and to climate change, that communities that have the intersection of being both majority people of color, as well as lower socioeconomic status, are quite predictably and reliably going to have a higher load of these environmental toxins that we know are detrimental to mental well-being, or even the negative sequela of climate change. And so what you see when there are adverse early life experiences, when people have experienced these traumas, when people are in societies that have a frayed safety net and they don't have the means to achieve educationally or in terms of their career, that it feeds into reduced options or poor choices, behavioral risk factors, psychological stress responses, and psychological stress. And all of those things are associated with adverse mental health outcomes. So in our society, right, there are decisions that we make. There's a certain allowance we have for people being homeless, for kids going hungry. And this is in spite of decades of research that shows us these things have negative consequences for people's health. And so we have the social determinants of mental health, but we also have the societal structures that decide how these social determinants impact populations. And as a society, our decisions have essentially guaranteed that significant proportions of our society are exposed to things that we know are harmful. And because of the way that race is ingrained in our society, these decisions and these adverse social determinants of health disproportionately affect minoritized populations. So, one of the things that comes up in discussions of race is people saying, well, we've come so far, and it's not as bad as it used to be. And people will sometimes seek solace in that, or perhaps even minimize concerns that are raised by other people because of it. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist, but also a revolutionary thinker. And he said once and for all, and I will state this principle: a given society is racist or it is not. And, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from too, I was born in this country. My family is in this country. I am a psychiatrist. I am part of the mental health care system and the mental health industrial complex, if you will. But I criticize both this country and that complex because of my connection to it and my passion for it and the people that they involve. This is a quote by James Baldwin: "I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." So at times I may seem critical of the mental health care system, but it's because of my passion for mental health. So John Rawls described social justice as assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. White privilege is certainly an ongoing feature of not just American society, but in many places in the world. And when you think about all of the ways that it is baked into other forms of advantage, certainly people who are people of color are going to be more susceptible to falling into this category of the least advantaged members of society. And when we think about mental health and not just treating illness, having a sense of autonomy, having a belief that your decisions about your life are going to actually impact your life, having hope about opportunity are all bedrocks of mental well-being. They're all things that are going to promote mental health. And when you have a society, or you're in a society that is stratified by race, there are ways that protection and access and liberty and rights and opportunities can be shaped by your belonging in a certain racial group. And so I welcome you to think about these principles of social injustice. I welcome you to think about how they could impact someone's ability to attain that World Health Organization definition of mental health. And I welcome you to think about how they could disproportionately impact people of color. So essentialism, the belief that there are distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. Erasure of context, failure to consider socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities, biological determinism, the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different, and cultural determinism, the false belief that differences in ethnic groups are the result of cultural factors. And then I also welcome you to do the same when it comes to types of oppression. So exploitation, which is the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. Cultural imperialism, establishing the ruling class culture as the norm and the othering of groups that are not part of the dominant culture. So for example, what you see often with cultural imperialism, right, is that I've been to many cultural competency seminars or days or even entire conferences, and I have yet to have a talk or hear a talk about white culture, right? And that's because white culture is centered as the norm against which everything else is judged, and it's assumed to be the right one, and that's because it is the dominant culture. And it's not that you couldn't have talks about white culture, and it's not that it's not incredibly relevant given the power structure of the country, and some might even say the world. Powerlessness, so when oppressed groups lack power and are blocked from obviously gaining power. Marginalization, expelling specific groups from meaningful participation in society, and violence. And this could include physical violence as well as structural violence, or violence that's at the hands of systems. So actually, this morning just gave a talk about gun violence. And the gun violence talk that I gave in some ways illustrates the cultural imperialism and the violence piece of this. And so the talk came about because of a talk at this very same conference that I'm at now a year ago. And it was a talk about gun violence, and it was completely focused on mass shootings and the high profile mass shootings that, often are involving, shooters with these manifestos or environments where people thought people should be safe, where they didn't expect something like that to happen in this neighborhood. And one of my colleagues, who's a psychiatric physician in Baltimore, stood up and gave this impassioned comment about how the people he sees who are victims of gun violence in his job, taking care of people in inner city Baltimore, that they're never centered in these talks, that their pain, their trauma, their suffering isn't given the same attention, even though day in, day out, the face of gun violence is not what you see with these mass shooters. It is Black and brown boys and men. And that even in societal discourse around it, even when they're discussed as shooters or as perpetrators of violence, there's not the same understanding that often they are on the receiving end and have been for some time. So there's a way that certain types of shootings that happen in neighborhoods where we don't expect them are covered and discussed, and where those victims get a certain level of empathy and outpouring of support, whereas in other communities, there's this kind of tacit acceptance of violence as the norm and as something that is okay and that we don't touch or try to address.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
So this is a fairly recent recreation of the Clark doll experiments. Husband-wife team that was part of the Supreme Court case that helped to call for desegregation of schools. Now, schools are still quite segregated, but part of what this was used for was to argue that segregation was harmful, right? And so, this was many years ago, but this is something that continues to be the case where even post-Brown, those messages of who is good and who is bad, who has an association with negative traits and who has an association with positive traits, is one that we are all bombarded with from a very early age, and is one that we all take in from a very early age. And when you recreate this with kids of different races, not just Black kids, everyone knows the Black doll is the one who has the bad characteristics. So why do I show this to you? I show this to you because it is an illustration of how early these messages start to sink in. It's also an illustration of how people who have nothing to gain by taking in these messages and believing these messages still can and may. And it's important to understand, while there may be some markers of progress in our society, the hierarchies still exist. And when we're considering mental well-being, when we're considering self-concept, when we're considering opportunity and dreams and the ability to make a contribution to people's society, these beliefs that are internalized by the people who are marginalized, but also the beliefs that are held by the people in positions of power, can shape all of those things, right? And it doesn't have to be something where there is malicious intent or even a conscious act in order for these beliefs to make their way into the extension of opportunity or the extension of inequitable penalties and the like. So this has to do with unconscious bias, right? But I also think it's always important to pair discussions of unconscious bias with discussions and frank acknowledgement of racism and of intentional racism and of people who use race on purpose to keep people marginalized and to keep resource allocation in a certain manner. So when we think about mental health inequities, you can't really think about mental health inequities and you can't really discuss them fully without also considering societal inequities, given what we know about the social determinants of health. And we also can't think about them without acknowledging the way that these hierarchies make their way into how we treat people. And when I say we, I mean us as a society, but I also mean people in the mental health care system sometimes. And when we look at health inequities, they are the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. So for the purpose of this talk, we're thinking about those barriers that may disproportionately impact people of color. So there's a way, right, that sometimes we focus on this idea that if you go to cultural competency and you learn about Latinx people or you learn about Asian people, that you now are ready to work with people who are of different race than you. So you have checked off the boxes and become culturally competent. But there's been pushback to that, and with good reason, right? So these groups are incredibly diverse, right? They're very heterogeneous. And it makes it seem as if we don't have our own culture that we bring to these interactions. As a physician, there's a culture of medicine that is part of that interplay. As a faith community, right, there's a culture of your faith community that is part of that interplay. It's not just about the culture of the other person, right? And so with cultural and instructional humility, there is self-evaluation, there's curiosity, and there's bidirectional learning. And there's an appreciation for the fact that this is an open-ended process, that you never know all there is to know about any group of people. And that because of those issues of intersectionality and different salience that may be attributed to different parts of people's identity, there's a need to always be humble and open-minded when trying to work across. One of the things I just wanted to highlight is this issue of trauma, right? So we know that there have been in the past, well, I can't even say in the past few years, but there's trauma that disproportionately impacts people of color. And disproportionately isn't even the right word. There's trauma that is targeted toward people of color, kinds of trauma that they have to contend with or contend with the threat of that are solely because of something they absolutely cannot change, and that's the color of their skin. And when it comes to the mental health care system or to mental illness, we, given our diagnostic criteria and the way that we talk about people, using the symptoms in our, DSM and our book we use for diagnoses, we really don't have language. We really don't have something that captures race-based trauma. There is not acknowledgement of it in the book that we use that gives us the diagnoses that are given to people. So why does that matter? It matters because often when you don't have language for something, it's not counted, it's not seen. And so sometimes what you may have is that people's experiences in the mental health care system, rather than helping them address their trauma and heal from them, become recreations of their trauma because of the lack of accounting for traumas that disproportionately impact groups that are marginalized on the basis of race. So one of the things that often comes up, and I will use Black people as an example here, is this issue of stigma. And stigma is real, right? There is mental health stigma. It absolutely exists. When you're part of a group that's already marginalized because of race, having the stigma of mental health superimposed on that can be very distressing and can be aversive to people. But it's also really important to keep in mind practically what has happened with race in this country, which is that resources are not equitably allocated. And so when Blacks were asked why they do not get mental health services, cost was the most commonly cited reason for not seeking care. This is twice as often as minimization of symptoms and nearly 5 times as often as stigma. And it's a really important point, right? Because it shows you how the prevailing narrative doesn't bear out when you actually talk to people who are impacted by it. But it also has implications for what we do as members of society who want to try to help address these inequities, right? It's not just about anti-stigma campaigns, but it's about the accessibility of mental health care services and mitigating financial barriers that disproportionately impact people of color. This is a video of a young boy who was playing basketball in his front yard, sees something out of the corner of his eye, and hides. It's a police officer who's going by, and his dad actually asked him, son, why did you do that? Because this was the home surveillance footage. And the young boy told his father, because they killed George Floyd. Now, there's no mental health diagnosis for being a Black boy and seeing police murder someone who looks like you, but certainly it's something that has a mental health impact and is a stressor and shapes behavior and impacts thoughts. So again, when we're thinking about mental well-being and the language we have and the ways that we can serve or help people, it's important to acknowledge that when it comes to race-based trauma or trauma that's based on ethnicity, there's no escaping it. It's not something that is necessarily post, right? It's something that people have to live with. And that's a different kind of stressor. And it's something that if healthcare systems or people trying to support mental health aren't able or willing to acknowledge, there's a risk of actually doing more harm than good. So this is a skit from the show that's not on anymore, but it's called Key and Peele. And the comedian, is behind Barack Obama, who's president at the time. And one of the skits that they had on their show was an Obama interpreter, right? And it was, humorous and actually quite funny. But the idea was, as a Black man in a position of power, there was a certain level of equanimity that President Obama had to have. And the skit only worked with the first and only Black president because the range of emotions available for people to display who are all the other presidents who were white men is really different. And the skit was a humorous, kind of world stage example of this, but it really speaks to a larger issue of what it means to be a person of color in a society, what it means to already know that people may be looking at you differently, what it means to already know that people may not think you deserve to be in places, and the pressure that can put on you to get it right all the time. So what I see in my private practice, where I see a lot of people of color, but who are middle class or upper middle class, they're not dealing with the stressors of poverty or community violence, but they're dealing with the stressors of not feeling as if they have the same room for error as their counterparts, and the tremendous burden that can come with that. So this takes us into this burden of resilience, right? We often talk about the resilience of communities and the resilience of people, and that is really important and something to keep in mind. And I'm not anti-resilience, don't get me wrong, but at a certain point, right, the question has to be asked, who do we ask to be resilient and why? Because there are certain people in society that we think of as more worthy of protection and understanding than others. And there are other people that we expect to just absorb the hits and the violence and the badness and to be okay. And so the emphasis on protection and prevention is one that is really important to think about, particularly as it pertains to marginalized populations. So how could this inform mental health? How could it inform interactions with people who are members of the BIPOC community if you yourself are not a member, or maybe you're a member of the BIPOC community, but you enjoy some level of privilege or authority. So understand there are some things that perhaps you should not take personally when you're trying to interact across races. Reactions to you may be based on experience-based distrust of systems, of people in authority, or of white people. And everyone has been exposed to racist messaging and trained in racist systems and must take a stance of cultural and structural humility. But there are some things that I would encourage you all to take personally. So understanding color blindness for the microaggression it is. When you say, I don't see color, what you're often saying is, I see everything and everyone through my lens, and I'm centering my experience and devaluing theirs. Guarding against premature closure, so understanding that bias can make its way into how we think about things. And so being deliberate about questioning our assumptions can help us with countering that. And then practicing self-care, and I'll come back to that in a second. Examine and account for you and your decision makers' limited exposure and knowledge. And this applies to any of you who are in leadership or administrative positions, right? As it pertains to education, team makeup, team voice, and intentional consideration of potential differential impacts on people of color. And then one of the things that has come up quite a bit in the past few years, and there's kind of been this wave, and I'm not sure where your particular community is on this at this point, but this idea of resource groups. So having groups for people who identify with certain minoritized racial groups. So like a Black worship group or an Asian worship group or something of that nature. And this is just a stock photo that's in the presentation software I use, but I thought it was interesting that the Black woman is off and to the side and not part of the group. And we know that when it comes to mental well-being, that being part of a group, feeling connected, feeling seen are all really important. And so while in some cases it may be controversial or you may get some pushback about having things that are just for X group of people, what we know is that in societies where they're facing marginalization writ large, having those groups can actually be quite protective and beneficial for their mental well-being, because it's a place of validation and a safe space from the stressors that come in broader groups. So James Baldwin said, ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And all of you in your own way has some degree of power. And if you're not familiar with these issues or some of the things raised in this talk, there are all kinds of ways to learn more. So when we think about advocacy, developing a knowledge base, recognizing injustice in your role in addressing it, responding to it, and then iterating and sustaining. So it's cool to read the books and listen to the podcasts, but the next step, right, is thinking about how you can apply it to what you do. So the question, the last question I'll ask is, how can every person realize her own potential, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to her or his community in a society that fails to assure equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, and chooses not to care for its least advantaged members? And that goes back to that definition of mental health and that definition of social justice. And so fundamentally, I would posit that justice is a mental health issue. And perhaps even more so for people who are facing marginalization. So one of the things that is really critical as you strive to make a dent in this work, right, is to check in with yourself. And I say that because what we know about bias, what we know about hard work that's really big and complicated, is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to do it from a place where you yourself are depleted. When people have less mental bandwidth, they're more likely to rely on stereotypes. And we know from studies that people actually can consciously counter their bias if they're in a headspace to do it. And so self-care and being intentional about that is actually an essential element of being able to support the well-being of people from marginalized communities. There's a young man, and he calls himself the son of Baldwin, and he said this on Twitter, actually. So a lot of people thought James Baldwin said it, but it's Robert Jones Jr. But he said, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." So sometimes during these conversations, right, it can be really uncomfortable to acknowledge the difference that people's different experiences, right? It can be really uncomfortable to acknowledge privilege. But there's a way that requires people who are marginalized to stifle their voices. And there's a way that it centers the comfort of the dominant group rather than giving freedom of expression to the non-dominant group. And so when we're thinking about mental health of BIPOC communities, I think it's really appropriate to consider principles of trauma-informed environments so that there's safety from the top down throughout the organization. There is commitment to the creation and maintenance of an environment where everyone feels physically and psychologically safe, where the organization runs in such a way that staff and clients experience it as fair, consistent, and understandable. And we know that this is something that's good for everybody in a work environment, but even more so for minoritized people. And there are studies that back that up as it relates to people who are minoritized based on race, but also for women. Peer support and self-help, and this gets back to supporting things like those peer groups, and then collaboration and mutuality, intentionality, and valuing and giving space for all voices through meaningful sharing of power and decision-making, and recognizing that everyone in the organization has a role to play in providing trauma-informed service, and awareness and appreciation of cultural and structural context. And I welcome you all to think about your power and where it lies. And all of us have some degree of a mix of these things. So power over, where some are able to influence and coerce others; power to, where you're able to change existing hierarchies; power with, the collective power of community or organizations. And it's that power with is so meaningful, and I really applaud your church for having these dialogues. And then power within, the individual capacity to exercise power.
It is unreal, and as well done as anybody, man or woman, has competed in.
There we go, right off the bat, the very first tumbling pass. Triple twisting, double back.
Money. Just keep making it.
So I end with that because I know I've talked a lot about the disproportionate burden of trauma in people of color, but there certainly is resilience in these communities as well. And Simone Biles just became the most decorated female gymnast ever. And is heading back to the Olympics again, and based on publicly available information has an ACE score of 4. So didn't want it to be all doom and gloom today in this topic. And she's someone who has a history of mental health issues and has acknowledged and treated them and been very transparent about them as well. So thank you all for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinson, for your presentation and also for that video of Simone Biles. I'm really excited to see her in the Olympics, but thank you so much for the present. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch this as well because you just dropped so much good information that I'm gonna have to just kind of think back and reflect. But we do have a few questions, and some of them I feel like you've answered them in like as they were coming in, you kind of answered them throughout your presentation. But one of the questions, so those that are participating today and those that will be watching the recorded version, it's a mix of clergy and laity. Some of them are serving in, some of the clergy are serving in churches that may look a lot like them, or it might be that they are the only one that look like themselves in that congregation. What are some ways that congregations can kind of address mental health and be a safe space for healing?
Yeah, so there's tremendous potential, right, in congregations and in being a safe space. And there are many ways, like if you look at the US society as a whole, people of color are more likely to be religious and to regularly attend church services, right? So that means that there is a potential for that to be a real place where we can start to have some of these conversations. When it comes to kind of how I think the church's role can be different, sometimes the message is mixed about what engaging in formal mental health treatment means about your faith, right? Sometimes it can be something that's posed as a tension between, praying enough and being having enough faith in God and His willingness to be there for you and to have your best intentions at heart, or going to mental health services. And so sometimes that explicit acknowledgement of the fact that there has been a tension in some cases in the past in terms of how that's been framed, and it being clear from leaders in the congregation that it's not an either or, that it can be a both and, that they're not opposed to each other, that there's ways that actually can work together, I think is an important message. When it comes to people who are serving in communities that are very different from their own, having opportunities to interact with people where the power differential has been intentionally mitigated is really important, right? So it may be difficult for people who are members of your congregation to speak to you candidly. So it may be that there are other people who are part of that community, who may not be part of your faith community, but are part of that community, that can be resources to you in terms of learning about things that are relevant, learning about stressors. And I think that would be a good place to start, because understanding that even if you're well-intentioned, power differentials make it very hard for people to be candid. And if you're not a person of color and you're in a leadership position, there's already automatically 2 power differentials. There's the one of race and the one of position. And so even if you are well-intentioned, that's going to compromise communication potentially.
Thank you. So another question, and I think because of time, this might have to be our last question. There is hesitation in communities of color to seek therapy. And then there's also, there's been studies that's been out that like even medically, that a lot of the way that physicians are trained are to help white bodies and not bodies of color. And so, and I wish there were that there were multiple copies of you that is that sensitive to all the diversity. But how do we counter one, I guess, the hesitation to seek therapy, and also knowing that there is that hesitation because we might not get the services that we need?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So, one of them is, I think it's important whenever that question comes up, though, is to acknowledge, at least what I'm seeing on the ground floor, there's actually a very significant generational difference. That if you look at like Gen Z and even young millennials, I won't say it's completely abolished, but like it's a different kind of conversation when it comes to mental health services and seeking therapy and that sort of thing. There's more dialogue about it. It's more culturally sanctioned, and that's even in minority communities. So I think it's always important to kind of pin that piece of it. When it comes to services, my analogy for that is that with mental health services, you got to find the right fit, right? So if you have your car and it's rattling and smoking and you take it to a mechanic and they try to rip you off, you don't say, oh, well, I'm going to ride around in this rattling and smoking car, right? Like you keep going to different mechanics until you get one who can fix it, because your car is too important. Well, if you live in a car dependent city like Atlanta, like I do, your car is too important for you to just let it keep operating that way. Right. So when it comes to mental health, sometimes it is going to take going to a few therapists. It's going to take trying on a few people. It's going to take figuring out who's a good fit for you. But going through that process and the time that it takes to invest in the process is absolutely worth it. So helping people understand that it may be a process from the front end and it's about fit. And that fit for people of color is going to include them being able to talk about those experiences of life that are because of being part of that marginalized group.
Thank you so much. We're going to be moving into the legislative component of our time now. And just as Dr. Vinson mentioned that, it's not about just learning, but it's also about acting and doing. And so, the purpose of these webinars is so that we can educate, so that we can advocate. And I am thankful to have my colleague, Reverend Kendall McBroom, here today to kind of share with us how we can get involved today. So thanks, Kendall.
All right. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Dr. Vinson, for a phenomenal presentation. I echo Amy's words. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch to take different nuggets. There were a lot of nuggets that I took from that in notes. But one thing that was poignant that I think that you shared, and I'm not quoting it verbatim, but to kind of synthesize, was the need to acknowledge our own privilege wherever we might be in this, acknowledge the privilege that we bring to the table, and how do we utilize that for good? How do we utilize that to essentially help and uplift and bring about a holistic liberation and peace and justice for everyone? My name is Kendall McBroom, everyone, and thank you for being with us this afternoon, or morning, or evening, whatever time you might be watching this. For those that are visually impaired or have other disabilities, I am a Black man, a young Black man with Black curly hair, wearing a blue sweatshirt and a beard. And I'm going to talk to you today about an action alert that we have, and a way that you can get involved as far as bringing about what Dr. Vincent has shared, bringing about the assistance and bringing about the aid that so many in our communities are desperately in need of. The action alert has to deal with the Better Mental Health Care Act for Americans Act, Better Mental Health Care for Americans Act, sponsored by Senator Michael Bennet and Chairman Senator Wyden. As we all know, America does face a deep mental health crisis, and for generations, decades, if you will, it has gone untapped and unaddressed. However, this bill And along with that, in struggling with mental health and many struggling with the access and affordability, this act would require parity for mental and behavioral health services in Medicare Advantage, Medicare Part D, and Medicaid. So that for the elderly in particular, as well as encourage mental health and behavioral integration with physical care by increasing reimbursement rates for Medicare and Medicaid. Establish a demonstration project to increase access to integrated mental health behavior care for children across different settings like schools. And Dr. Vinson touched on this throughout in having to really address the systems that we are a part of, and how they bear down and really hinder our mental well-being, and how we can do that. And so this is what this bill does. And so we encourage you on the next slide that will come up to use the QR code. Use that to engage in this moment of action, to have Congress take this seriously, and take mental health seriously, and to do something about it. So we encourage you to use that QR code to go to our website, complete the link, complete the action alert, and share it. I further encourage you to share it with people in your circle, in your community, in your sphere of influence, so that Congress and our elected officials will know that this is something we want to see acted upon. This is something that we want to see things done on. Because we know that as the faith community and as believers, Scripture tells us as we follow Jesus that he came that we might have life and have that life more abundantly. And so that life is not just our physical well-being, but our mental well-being as well. And so with that being said, I turn it back over to Amy. And thank you again, Dr. Vinson.
Thanks, Kendall, so much. A sincere thank you to Dr. Vinson for speaking to us today and for the presentation. As closing announcements, by the end of the day, you will be receiving an email with a link to the recorded webinar and other resources mentioned, including the action alert. Today's webinar is the second of the series that will be offered every Wednesday and Thursday for the next 3 weeks. I hope that you will join us next Wednesday for Holding Sacred Space, Mental Health and Climate Change with Dr. Janet Lewis and Sherwin Shabdar. And thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day. Bye-bye.